Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to Unit 6, Exercise Scenarios. We are going to go through a series of scenarios, and we're going to ask folks to respond with what you might think would be appropriate responses to each of the scenarios. So let's start with exercise scenario 1. One shelter resident needs assistance using the restroom. There are no accessible toilets, though one appears to be big enough for the resident to enter and turn around while in her wheelchair. What do you do? Vicki, can you read some of the responses?
Yeah, so it'll take just a minute for some of the people to start writing in the chat. And I want to remind people that they can think back to some of the MacGyver solutions that we talked about earlier in the training. So I see one coming in. They say that they would put in a request for an accessible toilet. And that's a good long-term solution. But of course, you need to do something in the meantime. Oh, so here's a good suggestion that they would look for temporary solutions, look at removable grab bars, maybe a toilet seat riser. Those are great ideas. I just want to remind people to check with the shelter staff to see if they have any of these items on site before making the request through the county emergency manager. So let's go on to the next one.
Okay.
Barry.
All right, scenario 2. A shelter resident that you have been directed to by the shelter staff appears to have a developmental disability that makes gripping utensils and cups difficult. He is having a hard time eating on his own. What do you do?
So we'll just wait a minute or two for people to. Oh, here's a good one, a real MacGyver response. They happen to have duct tape in their emergency kit, and they would use that and perhaps a washcloth to create a thicker handle for his eating utensils. So
that's a great idea.
That is a really good idea. They would also see if there was any utensils like the styrofoam tubing to add onto the handles, a weighted cup so that it wouldn't tip over. Someone else says perhaps a cup with a handle might be easier. That might work. You might use some of that duct tape to make that handle a little bit more sturdy. And in the meantime, if none of those worked, they would look and talk to perhaps family members or other people who might be with the individuals to see if they could provide assistance until they could get some of these solutions in place. All good ideas.
Great ideas. Thank you. Scenario 3. You have finished assisting the individuals that the shelter staff had identified as needing help. As you walk through the registration area, you notice an elderly man having difficulty communicating with the registration staff. What can you do to assist?
Well, let's see what they do with this one. They're being so creative. Someone suggested to use the Show Me communication tool to see if using pictures would help. They would try written communication, thinking that perhaps this is mostly speech or hearing restriction or speech restrictions. So they would look at using a pen or paper, perhaps an iPad or tablet. Those are all good ideas. They would, if they determined that the person needed an ASL interpreter, they would request that through the the shelter manager. And those are all excellent ideas. I also check and see if someone is with the individual, or see if it's a community shelter, if someone might know the individual and could help provide more information.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Finding out if someone does know him. Scenario 4. A new shelter resident with specific needs is demanding that shelter workers serve as their personal care assistant. This resident will require help with dressing and undressing, bathing, and toileting. Can they be allowed into the shelter? If so, what kinds of accommodations might they need? If no, where would you send them?
So, oh, good. Someone said yes, they would be allowed into the shelter. So that is the correct answer.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Another person posed an answer with a question mark. So I think they're saying request a personal care assistant, question mark. Absolutely, that is a service that could be requested. Someone else suggested maybe finding out if the person has a home health provider, and contacting that organization to see if they could come to the shelter. And while this isn't on here, I want to remind people to remember that there might be people in the shelter who would be willing to provide assistance to this individual. So some discreet questioning of other shelter guests might be appropriate here.
And that's very appropriate too. You might find people in the shelter are more than happy to have something to do. So making sure you have someone that's appropriate would be great. Okay, scenario 5. A shelter resident tells you that he lost his walker when he was rescued. What do you do?
So, and that will happen frequently. So this would probably be something that the folks being trained might see it come across. So here's one. They would check with the shelter manager to see whether or not they have an extra walker on site that the person could use. And if not, another person suggests putting in a request for a walker with the shelter manager. And sometimes they have those on the mass care support shelter trailers.
And, you know, even in a pinch, if you need something temporarily, a wheeled office chair might help.
Yes.
So that's the MacGyver part of these sort of.
Yeah, and really, Sherry, too, sometimes just a chair that could be slid on the floor without wheels sometimes might be a good alternative, a little bit more stable if the person is unsteady on their feet. So
Yeah, that's true. All right, scenario 6. Shelter staff tells you that local law enforcement brought in an individual who was rescued to the shelter. The shelter staff has determined that this person needs more individual assistance than they can handle, given the low number of people staffing the shelter. What do you do?
So, yeah, so someone suggested that the first thing to do would be to sit down and chat with the individual who came to the shelter and find out what kind of needs that they have. That's always a good first response. The individual who needs assistance is probably the best expert on what they need. If someone suggested that if once those needs are identified, to either see if there's anyone, any devices or equipment that could be uh, uh, acquiesced or requested to help the individual. To see, this one says again to use, to see if anyone in the shelter might know the individual and could help, or if there's anyone in the shelter who might be able uh, to help the individual while he's there. And again, you can always put in a request for personal care assistance if that kind of level of service is necessary through the shelter manager.
Right. Scenario 7. As you walk through the dormitory area of the shelter, you observe an adult that is showing signs of distress. You determine that it is due to the high level of noise in the dormitory. How can you help?
Oh, someone's really quick. Noise canceling headphones or just any kind of earphones that might dampen the noise. Someone else suggested seeing if there was a more quiet area in the shelter that they would be willing to move to. But I think we also need to chat with the individual and find out what is causing them distress. It might be the noise, it might be something else. But if it is the noise, these are all really great suggestions.
Scenario 8. A middle-aged male is outside the shelter talking to himself in a loud and angry voice. He is scaring some of the shelter residents. What do you do?
Okay, so someone suggested to approach the individual in a calm manner, not getting too close to make them feel threatened. That's a good strategy. Talk with them a little bit more about why they're so upset to see if exactly what's going on. This is a good suggestion, trying to suggest that the individual move to a more private place where there isn't so much of an audience to have the conversation, and then to involve mental health services and security if necessary. And those are all good, fast responses.
Well, and then the other thing too is this person might be talking on a phone. So
Yes,
could be the simplest solution.
right.
All right. Scenario 9. An individual comes in using a wheelchair. His only request is that he will need assistance getting into and out of his assigned cot. What can you do to help?
So someone suggested seeing if there was a transfer belt or a board, on site in the shelter, or one that could be requested from the county emergency manager or found in the mass care support shelter. Those are all good ideas. The other suggestion was see if the cot could talk to the guy and or person to see exactly what kind of assistance he would need. It might be that a higher cot might be easier for him to transfer to, or a cot that is more stable, so up against the wall. But if none of these can provide him the assistance he needs, you might request a personal care assistant through the shelter manager and the county emergency manager.
Great answers.
Yeah, I think they've been paying attention.
Scenario 10. The county has transported several individuals from the affected areas to the shelter. One of them is someone who is deafblind. The staff at the registration area is having a hard time communicating with this individual. How can you help?
They suggested the Show Me communication tool, depending on the level of blindness. That's a good one, especially if you have it on electronically, because you can make it bigger. That might help. Someone suggested requesting a deaf-blind interpreter through the county emergency manager. That is a good one. But in the meantime, what else could you do? So here's one. You could use pencil and paper. Perhaps the person can write, or you can write in large print. And this hasn't come up yet, but I want to remind people about these finger spelling in a person's palm. Many deafblind individuals can, communicate in a situation like this if you use capital letters and write in the palm of their hand. So all really good suggestions.
Thank you. Scenario 11. While doing a walkthrough of the shelter, you notice that it doesn't have an accessible shower. What are some things you could do about this situation?
So here we go. Check to see if one could be turned into an accessible shelter with a temporary modification. That would require some MacGyvering, so it would depend on the individuals who might need the accessible shelter and what their needs are. But the suggestion also is here to put in a request for an accessible shower unit. And that might be ultimately the best solution.
Okay, last one. Scenario 12. You are not able to understand the speech of a man who is in a wheelchair wanting to enter the shelter. He is alone and is unable to write notes. What should you do?
So we're waiting a bit for people to think about this one. The last
Come on,
one.
last one.
Yeah, might be the hardest one now. So use pictures to try to communicate. So the Show Me book might help. If the phone system is working, use speech-to-speech relay service. So this might, you might be able to access someone to provide communication assistance. These individuals have strong language recognition skills. So look at that. Let's see. There are people who are unable to speak so other people can understand them. See if there is some natural way that would allow them to communicate. Check with other people in the shelter to see if they know the individual. Ask very basic questions, someone said, and that's a good one. Is there someone here you know? You can actually show them some of the people in the room to see if they recognize anyone. Check and see if they have a speech generating device with them or a picture book. Use yes or no questions. That's a good one. You can shake your head yes or no. As the person speaks, say what you think you heard back to them to make sure that you're communicating correctly. That's a good one. Let's see. Of course, check to see if they have an electronic communication device. So those are all really good responses. Sherry, I think they've got this.
Yeah, I think they do too. All right. Are there any questions at all? Does anybody have any questions? I know this is people's most favorite part because they get to think through some of the issues that may come up. So glad that you're all here. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Any questions in the chat box, Vicki?
No, none.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much. We will be back in 5 minutes.